very first episode of Quid Verum presents Caffeinated Catholic Conversations. We are honored and very privileged to have as our first guest of Caffeinated Catholic Conversations, Mr. Stephen Brady. Hi Stephen, how are you?
Hello folks, and thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here.
So Stephen, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Roman Catholic faithful?
Okay, the organization started about 1996, and I had no intentions, no idea this was going to happen, develop the way it did. Basically, it was my 7 children in a public school, and it started out with, my oldest was 14 at the time, and it started out as a problem with the local school district and a X-rated pornographic sex education program they had in the classroom that was basically destroying the innocence of our young people. And my children, my oldest especially, my youngest, weren't subjected to it yet. And the problem I had when I started to confront the school board and the teacher, most of the school board members were Catholics. And the teacher that was bringing the worst problematic material in was a Catholic at the local parish, who also taught religion at the local parish. So I went to the local priest when the school board refused to remove this pornographic material. I went to the local priest and I asked Father to do something. And what he told me was, Steve, you're not going to change anything. That was rather disheartening and rather angered me. So I went to the bishop. I contacted the bishop, Bishop Ryan at the time, and he basically put me off, wanted to meet with me sometime. And I just couldn't believe the runaround I was getting when what these Catholics were doing was promoting mortal sin. You know, objectively speaking, they were promoting destroying innocence of children. And I thought, I started to look at my own faith a little closer and realized, where it might be lacking and the needs of some changes. So I started to write the priest of the diocese for advice. I said, the bishop, my pastor won't help me. The bishop won't help me. I said, can any of you priests out there give me some advice as a father, parent of 7 children? What can I do to make the point with these teachers, these school board members who are Catholics, but promoting mortal sin? And several priests wrote me back, Stephen, don't you know? And so I inquired further, what are you talking about, Father? And it became very, very clear. Several of the priests informed me that the bishop was an active homosexual. And there was a big problem amongst the hierarchy in this diocese and the clergy regarding that issue. And they weren't going to do anything to defend Catholic teaching, Catholic faith. I really couldn't believe what I was hearing. I mean, at that point, I was very naive. So I started to investigate. I interviewed several of the priests who contacted me. A majority of the priests didn't want to talk about it. They thought I was crazy. Similar situation today. Most of the priests have sold out to one vice or another, I think, in my opinion, based on their activities. So I did interview a few priests that gave me firsthand testimony regarding Bishop Ryan's homosexual activity. This is all public now. I still couldn't believe everything I was hearing and saying, so they gave me tips and clues as to where I could get more information. I found a police officer that knew the bishop was cruising certain parts known for gay pickups and that sort of thing, the train station uptown. So the further I investigated, the worse it got, the more information I got, the more trouble I got. I was convinced in my naive way that surely if I got enough information, the hierarchy would take care of this. The Pope, the papal nuncio would deal with this, the cardinal. I contacted Cardinal Bernardine at the time. He wanted nothing to do with it. And this is my first glimpse of the corruption in the hierarchy. Cardinal Bernardine had authority over Bishop Ryan, yet didn't seem to be interested in what I was saying. I contacted some priests from Bishop Ryan's former diocese. He was put in Springfield in 1983. This was in 1986 when I started the fight. I found out that Bishop Ryan was known as a public drunkard. I found the newspaper articles. He was known as a predatory homosexual by the clergy and some young men in the Joliet diocese before he was ever sent to Springfield. And I began to get very troubled about this whole situation. So when I got enough firsthand testimony, because the last thing I want to do is destroy somebody's reputation, their good name with a lie. I had to be sure I had the truth. Once I was positive I had enough first-hand testimony, I started to go public. It was at this point I was contacted by a young lady, a saint in my opinion, Sanda El Raji. She was on the street a lot, had a rough home life, abused as a child herself. She carried around the book, The Imitation of Christ. She would go around, excuse me, she would spend time on the street of a late night with some of these street kids. I think she could relate to them. And she gave me the names of about 4 or 5 young men that the bishop was paying, would pick up at night on the street. He knew where the hangouts were. He would pick them up, take them to his apartment, and pay them for sexual favors. She gave me their names. The beauty of it was 3 or 4 of them was in different Illinois prisons. And I say the beauty of that because Illinois inmates cannot communicate with one another. So when I know I got testimony from one and went to another prison to speak to another, I knew I was getting the truth because they couldn't communicate with one another to find out what each was telling me. And also, there was a brutal honesty. These young men were in prison for bad checks or petty theft. It was minor infractions, but they were still in locked up for a few weeks or months at a time. So the most moving experience was Frank Bergen. And his name is very public now, and there's more stories written about him now. They can research that, as long as search the name of Bishop Ryan or Stephen Brady. I was in the prison interviewing Frank, and he began to tell me about his life as a child, adopted, abused, again adopted, but he did love his adoptive mother. But he ran away from home, got addicted to drugs, was living on the street at 15 years old. And he said, Mr. Brady, I ran away from home at the last time at 15 years of age. I prayed my mother would come get me one more time, and she never came. And this really damn near brought me to tears because I had 7 children. I could see some of my kids in this boy. He was a man at the time. He wasn't a young boy. He was 30 years old. But you start to realize some of these kids, these street kids, have been through so much in their life. But that statement by Frank just brought me to my senses and realized this has got to stop. I mean, these people are God's children as well, even though they're street kids, and most people wouldn't give them the time of day. So that being said, I got statements from 4 or 5 individuals about Bishop Ryan. I learned about other priests at the same time. And I was getting kickback. Father John Harden was helping me at the time, went to Vatican on my behalf with one of the priests who had given testimony against Ryan. Everybody was betraying us. Here I thought, if I give them the rock solid proof, they'll take care of it. But that was so far from the truth. The hierarchy was actually covering it up. They were threatening me. I was told to keep my mouth shut. The Vatican ordered me to keep my mouth shut. They sent a priest down to order me to keep my mouth shut. Cardinal George in Chicago, after Bernardine died, offered me a relationship with the hierarchy if I keep my mouth shut, whatever that meant, relationship with the hierarchy. Bishop Lucas told me it was a death threat, in my opinion, when he replaced Ryan. After Ryan retired, he said, what you do is dangerous, Steve. You realize that? And he told me there's no way I could get back in a good relationship at my parish unless I quit Roman Catholic faithful. So at every corner, at every turn, the church hierarchy I thought that would do something and help me was fighting me and protecting this perversion. So after much publicity, the Vatican had to investigate, and the investigation was called for. But Ryan was still living within the diocese in a home that the diocese owned. And I think the straw that broke the camel's back was when there was a domestic disturbance at Bishop Ryan's house. I found the young man he had an argument and a fight with. What it came down to is Bishop Ryan has stole another man's boyfriend. And there was a fight at Bishop Ryan's home, and the police were called. Imagine the embarrassment. And when this came out, because I made it public, they were trying to keep it quiet. They called the Solgen Center, just like the domestic disturbance between a man and a wife, but it was between a bishop and his boyfriend. And when I made this public, and those records, I think, too, are online at various locations, then the Vatican had to act. And Ryan was sent out of the diocese up to a nursing home. But as Bishop Lucas just last year admitted to at a bishop's conference, Well, listen, he's now in Oklahoma City. He's Archbishop. He said that during this investigation, it did come out, but he said he was ordered to keep it secret by the Vatican. So my family was disparaged, called all sorts of names, made fun of by Catholics, by the church hierarchy here in Springfield all these years. And even though we were dead on accurate, dead on right, they would never correct the mistake, the injustice they'd done to my family. So at that point, Ryan was over with. But by this time, I've been contacted by individuals around the world, several other countries, including South Africa, Ireland, Australia, Italy, wanting my help, wanting to use my name and our methods. So they'd use my name. I give them advice and help them what I could via the internet and research. And I started working in other states in this country because so much information was pouring in. And I would tell people, why do you call me? And they said, because Mr. Brady, we know you care and we know you'll do something. So that tells you a little bit about the mentality of these Catholics out there. The Catholic Church used to be a refuge, a place to go. If you needed something, a sanctuary, if you will. The young people and adults, you could go to the Catholic faith, go to the Catholic Church for protection, for help. That's all gone now. They're calling people like me, and I consider myself a nobody in the bigger scheme of things, a college dropout to go serve my country in the Army. I turned down a chance at West Point. And these folks are calling me, but I am a father and a grandfather, and I have faith now. I've learned of faith, especially since we started this. So at this point, we're working all over the country, and it wasn't until 2009, because of the bishops and the Pope's statements, the lies, in my opinion. They're going to do something. They've got a new child abuse policy. And a lot of people felt that maybe the hierarchy is going to do something now. So our support waned and people got less interested in fighting the good fight. So about 2009, RCF folded up. And we felt, well, maybe the hierarchy is going to deal with it. But then just last year, when the Cardinal McCarrick story came out, and the grand jury report from Pennsylvania, and Archbishop Bigelow came out with his public statements about the truth of the issue, then we realized how corrupt the hierarchy was. And it's what we were fighting the whole time. So we figured we had to open back up, which many people wanted us to. And so now we're back in action. Unfortunately, a lawsuit by a priest has got me a little tied up at the time, but we'll have that resolved shortly, I'm sure, God willing. And we'll be back at it. We're going to be back in Chicago mainly, and we're going to try to help the folks up there with the truth. And it's not out of hatred for anybody. It's out of love for the truth and the Catholic faith, because what's going on, you've got so many bishops promoting, either by their inaction or their action, promoting abortion by their silence, promoting the gay lifestyle by accepting homosexual speakers. And they introduce these children through these speakers to the gay lifestyle as if, and it leaves it up to the children to decide what's right or wrong. It doesn't make it clear when these, like Father Martin, when they come into a diocese, the hierarchy doesn't make it clear that homosexual activity is a mortal sin. Sex outside of marriage is a mortal sin. Cohabitation is a mortal sin. So you've got all these problems, and it's affecting the culture as well. And that's where we are today, still fighting the good fight as Roman Catholic faithful.
Stephen, you mentioned, I'm just going back a bit, but you mentioned South Africa. You were contacted from Ireland, Australia, and South Africa. So I just want to go back a bit to South Africa in particular, as our apostolate is based in South Africa. What led you to come to South Africa?
Well, my first contact from South Africa came from a member of Human Life International, someone that worked for Father Paul Marks in Human Life International in the 90s. And I discovered a network of homosexual clergy that were operating, and they were uniting on the internet. And some of the individual players who identified were from South Africa, involved in the clergy and the hierarchy. And I even had some contact with Cardinal Ratzinger at the time when he was head of the Congregation for the Faith regarding a certain member of the South African hierarchy. So I was in touch with Cardinal Ratzinger. A bishop gave me the contact information, and I was dealing with not only a bunch of homosexual clergy in this group that were from America, they were also several from South Africa, and one prominent figure from South Africa, whom I won't mention now. And that's when I was dealing with Cardinal Ratzinger over this situation. And that's how I became involved in South Africa, if you will. And then a newspaper and an attorney from South Africa contacted me because one of the individuals I was dealing with was caught in a sting there in having sexual relations with a teenage boy. It was of a consenting age in South Africa, they told me, but it was still a homosexual relationship. And I was advising them and giving them some information regarding this one individual. So that's what got us to South Africa. And I was working there off and on for a year, so made a lot of press there. If they search my name in the Cape Town paper, they'll come up with some of the stories. But that was the extent of it at that time.
With your involvement in the sort of Catholic Church space over the last few decades, how would you explain the state of our church currently? And what do you think, where do you think the causes lie for the current state of our church?
Well, I think the problem is obviously the corruption. Those individuals who are within the hierarchy, they've either lost their faith, a majority of them, or they have no faith. They never had any faith. That's evident by the fact that this stuff goes on, the cover-up goes on. If, for example, just recently the Cardinal McCarrick situation, we've been promised the full exposure by the Pope. It's not coming. Where is it? As far as who covered up for Cardinal McCarrick, it's obvious now from all the press reports and the first-hand testimony. I met and spoke to one of Cardinal McCarrick's victims, James Grimes. I know the man personally. I've had dinner with him. I've spoken to him. And he's got a lawsuit going on right now against the archdiocese there. But anyway, it's the majority of the hierarchy is corrupt. And I say the majority because how else could this have gone on for so long and been so corrupt? Now, I've worked with the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service in this country, on two cases. One in Joliet, Illinois, and one in Arlington involved priests stealing funds from parishioners. In other words, taking collections from the parish. And what I found in the one Joliet parish, the priest made a mistake. He didn't shred his garbage. And with the help of a janitor, we found out the priest had $500,000 in an out-of-state bank account with his secretary's name on it. Now, how does a priest making $20,000 a year with no inheritance get $500,000 in an out-of-state bank account? Well, it was clear he was at a big parish. And the feds, I was on the phone, the cell phone, to the janitor when the feds raided the parish. But the diocese, see, the money becomes the property of the bishop once it goes into the collection plate. So unless the bishop presses charges, the most these priests can be charged with is tax evasion, unless the bishop cooperates. And I found this time and time again, millions of dollars. And what I tell folks right now, the Catholic hierarchy in this country is nothing more than $1 billion money laundering corporation. There's billions of dollars going out of this country, out of the church, and we have no accountability, no idea where it's going. And in Chicago recently, the cardinal up there sold a parking lot across from the cathedral for $100 million. $100 million. He said the money went to help pay off lawsuits, but we have no idea, no accurate accounting of where the money goes. That's the case in so many instances. Millions of dollars are taken in by dioceses across the country, and there's no accountability. In this country, a church is exempt from all the reporting laws most not-for-profits are required to file. Like our organization has to required to file a regular tax form, a 990 every year, which we do. But the church hierarchy, they don't have to report this like we do, like every other not-for-profit. So you don't know where the money's going. You don't know who's getting paid what. You depend totally upon the honesty of the bishops.
So we'll carry on with the next one.
Okay.
Oh, so yes, Stephen. So we were chatting to you about the current crisis in the church, what you think the causes are, and you were mentioning corruption from a sort of financial perspective. What are your thoughts on the sexual scandal? You know, many people have their own opinions. Celibacy is often blamed. Pedophilia is often blamed.
Clericalism
Yeah.
is something that's coming out now. The
Right.
clericalism that I'm hearing from.
This
What is your take on that?
this idea of a clericalism is just a joke, really. Actually, as I was explaining, the corruption in any organization, in any group, it's never just one thing. It's always a combination of power, sex, money, and drugs. I mean, I found that in my investigations. Sometimes it's not all of them. Sometimes it's just a couple of them. But it all goes hand in hand, the power, sex, money, and drugs. And the corruption in the hierarchy, like I said, it's evident by the fact that the cleanup isn't being done. The exposure isn't being done. The honesty to the transparency isn't taking place. And we found that out in my investigations, but publicly with the Cardinal McCarrick situation, with the Pennsylvania grand jury, it's very clear that the corruption is there. So we don't know to what extent each individual bishop may be involved, but his silence, the silence of any bishop, speaks volumes.
Definitely.
So many bishops are compromised. They may not be sexually active. They may still believe in the faith. But these bishops that remain silent, in my opinion, they're compromised one way or another. Somebody has some goods on them, because why on earth would any bishop not speak out publicly like Bishop Strickland has been, or Bishop Burke, or Archbishop Vigano? Why would they not all speak out against this corruption, make clear to our young people what is a moral sin, what will send you to hell, what true charity is? So that tells you the degree of the corruption within the hierarchy, the fact that very few individuals are speaking out, because their silence tells us as much as anything else.
Has this become completely worse than the Boston Globe, when the Boston Globe did this article? Was it in 2001 or 2002? I might be mistaken. But has it gone, what was the protocol after the Boston Globe when all these cases started coming to the fore into mainstream media?
Well, the Boston Globe was the beginning. Actually, RCF was feeding the Boston Globe information. And RCF, our organization, had been making this stuff public 5 years before the Boston Globe, but they're a big press. You know, we didn't get the press like they did, but we were out there blowing our horn, if you will, speaking up, shouting from the rooftops, but not too many were listening. But that was only the beginning of the public exposure. And then after that came the cover-up, in my opinion. Much of what the hierarchy has done since then was merely to try to placate the Catholics, keep the money coming in. Because you realize sackcloth and ashes is not a part of their lifestyle, this hierarchy. You're not going to see these bishops stick around when they've got no fine meals, fine traveling, fine houses, mansions they live in, so on and so forth. Time and time again, you're going to hear of a local bishop or cardinal in this country spending millions of dollars upgrading his home, the diocesan home. They have millions of dollars squirreled away. We have no idea where the money is. And so the corruption, I think, is near complete in the fact that very few bishops are speaking up. And if a bishop's not speaking up, he's part of the problem. I don't know to what degree, but it's like me remaining silent while your house is on fire. I mean, you're part of the problem. And that's what we've got today in the corruption of the Catholic hierarchy. So the Boston Globe report was just the beginning of the public exposure. Now the hierarchy had to work that much harder to cover it up and to make people believe they were doing something. I was at the bishops' conference. Go ahead.
Stephen, as lay Catholics, what do you think our role can be to assist in a positive and constructive manner to address this crisis?
Well, first of all, God's got a plan for each and every one of us. I mean, I never thought I would be in the position I'm in today. I don't get paid for what I do, but I've love for the church, love for my fellow man. I mean, I've got to do something. I hate to even see a priest acting out this way and not realizing what he's doing. Objectively speaking, the mortal sin he may be involved in. So as Catholics, as I said earlier, they've got to get the Baltimore Catechism, or one equivalent in this country was the Baltimore Catechism, and learn the Catholic faith. They have to get a devotion to the Blessed Mother, get back to the sacraments completely, and start opening their mouth and defending church teaching, real church teaching. Stop going along with all the nuanced ideas and jokes that go on at the Mass, this new Mass. All this hand holding, this hugging and the kissing. We're not there for a community get together. We're there to worship Christ, and not there to hold hands and hug everybody and be everybody's friend. We can do that after Mass outside. As I said before, and I've said many times publicly, they got rid of the Code of Canon Law of 1917 because it was too harsh on homosexuals. They created a new one which lessened the language about homosexuals. They had to get rid of the Baltimore Catechism because it stated clearly only the consecrated hands of the priest could touch the sacred host. That was a clear teaching of the church for years. The layperson could not touch the sacred host, only consecrated hands. Then they had to get rid of the traditional Mass, which unfortunately many of our families have never seen before. Because with the traditional Mass, everything was cut and dry. It was worship. It was a holy sacrifice of the Mass. With the new Mass, you'll see parishes introducing dancing girls dancing down the aisles. You'll see gay banners hanging above the sanctuary. Yes, all this stuff, which is clearly forbidden. A female was never to be in the sanctuary, period. That was not speaking down to women or looking at women as less. In fact, it was much more. A woman doesn't belong in the sanctuary no more than a man can have a baby. I mean, we each have our own role, and the women's role was actually deleted, was made lesser by all this feminist movement, what have you, because the woman was much higher ranking than the man for many years. We always believed it. We always knew it. That's why you held the door for a lady. You never said a foul word in front of a lady. You showed respect to a female. No man ever laid his hand on a woman. It was great respect because the woman was everything, just like the mother of God, Mary, the teenage girl who was given the greatest gift of all, of any human being ever given. It was given to a woman. And these women that don't understand that, I feel bad for them because these young girls today need to demand respect. And I've made this in my feminist talk many times. I've made this fact before known. Growing up as a child, I lived in an ethnic neighborhood, Italian neighborhood. You never spoke out against a female in anybody's family. You'd get a little trouble some night from some male in the family. You never disparaged a female member of anybody's family. You always showed respect to the women in the family. Mom was everything, whether dad knew it or not. My grandmother always told me any good woman could completely control her husband while making him think he runs the world. You know, he don't know what's going on. Mom knows how to. Mom is the smart one. Mom is the family. There's no doctor. There's no priest. There's no lawyer without mom, period. And that's the way it is. But there was a role for man. He was the provider. And when it comes to decision making, that's why so many young ladies got mad because they said the man is in charge in the family. That's only in certain areas because he'd give his life for his wife and his family. But that being said, when it comes to certain decisions in life, no one knows what the mom knows. She carried that child for 9 months. When it comes to discipline and certain things, women, it's a common fact, they work on emotion. Sometimes we need that. But many times it needs to be the rational thinking of a man who doesn't let the emotion get in the way. I'm not disparaging the female at all. In fact, I'm giving man one slight little role in this whole situation in life. But it's a problem we have in the church today where there's no respect for females anymore. They've mixed the gender roles. Now you can see that by the transgender nonsense going on and the fact that women are running up and down the sanctuary and in the altars, handing out communion, that sort of thing. So
Stephen, just can I stop you there very quick? This Novus Ordo Mass with regards to now this altar girls. I'm just going to quote Cardinal Sarah and Bishop Athanasius Schneider, and they are very big on this point with regards to no Eucharist on the hand. We need to bring the reverence back to the Mass. We need to receive our Lord reverently, and they are very big promoters of going back to receiving the Eucharist on your tongue and kneeling, showing true reverence and respect to the showing true reverence and respect to the Blessed Sacrament. With this Eucharist on the hand and these extraordinary ministers, it has really diminished the sacredness now of, well, we can never diminish the sacredness of the Eucharist, but people are now not knowing who they're receiving because of Vatican II, this participation of everyone. That has caused a huge drop in the faith of the church, of the laity.
Absolutely, because if you believe God is truly present, as we do in the Eucharist, then how can you not receive? Every knee shall bend, to not kneel and to not receive on the tongue. And like I say, that goes back to the teaching for 2,000 years. Only the consecrated hands of the priests can touch the sacred host. When you take that all away, as you just mentioned, when you trivialize it so much, one priest told me it's like they're handing out potato chips up there. When they trivialize the Holy Communion so much, how can you expect the young people to believe? When anybody can go up there and hand out communion, no matter, these are the same people that are talking about their birth control use or their immoral lifestyle when they're outside at parish. Then they go up to Mass and they're called up there to hand out communion. I'm not saying there's not a lot of good people doing it, but I'm saying you trivialize it to that point. The belief in the real presence has diminished to almost 10, 15% at tops.
And we have to have these extraordinary ministers because we can't keep Mass we have to have Mass can't go over a specific amount of time. So it will just go quicker if we have the priest and a lay person to hand out the Eucharist. It just drives my head in where we need to go back and treat our Lord as he should be treated, where the priest should be handing the Eucharist, our blessed Lord, as he's got the sacred, exactly what I said, consecrated hands.
Here's a point you can make on that issue. When you discuss it with anybody, they call these people extraordinary ministers. Now, but when you have an extraordinary minister, whether there's 5 people there or 500, what's extraordinary mean? They'll have these, at one cathedral parish I go to, there's 6 extraordinary ministers. It doesn't matter if there's 50 people in the congregation or 1,000. They've got 6 people handing out communion, which is ridiculous. And it's everybody and anybody who can get up there, even young people who've just barely out of confirmation yet. And one South African priest, a priest from Kenya, not South Africa, Kenya, told me, he was in the States and I met him. He said, Mr. Brady, he said, in our country, he said, a priest isn't available for every parish every Sunday. When he's there, he said, people will wait hours to get communion. He said, it means that much. It's that special. And he said, they'll wait hours to receive communion. Only the priest gives out the communion. And he said, that's how it should be. And now it's these poor people in some of these African countries like Nigeria and Kenya, and they're being murdered by the Muslims simply for their Catholic faith. And too many of us Catholics have it too good. I mean, everybody's a Christian in the foxhole, as they say, when times get tough. But that being said, you're exactly right. We need to get back in belief in the real presence. And if the bishops start promoting that, if you believe in God, if you believe Christ is present, how could you not get on your knees? I mean, that's a good point to make, that very point.
Like I always will say, just last point on this, if Christ was truly present, if you're standing right in front of you right now, what would be your reaction? And the reaction I get, I would fall on my knees, I would adore. But then he's truly present in the Eucharist. We are taught as Catholics, the source of our faith, it's the summit of our faith. He is truly present, body, blood, soul, and divinity. So why don't you replicate that if you what you just told me?
Absolutely, you're right.
You mentioned a little while back that some of the priests and bishops have either lost their faith or never had any to start with. And that sort of leads me on to Dr. Taylor Marshall, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has recently written a book called Infiltration. And he speaks to the fact that the church over the decades had been infiltrated by people with no vocations, with an agenda to undermine the church from the inside. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, back in 1950, Bella Dodd made it clear. She testified before Congress. She was a communist attorney for the Communist Party. She made it clear back then in testimony before Congress, they placed a lot of communist plants inside the seminaries to corrupt the Catholic faith. See, the biggest obstacle to communism, to Marxism at one time, to immorality, was the Catholic Church. It used to be. And I don't know how much the infiltration came through the communist route or through just plain pure evil of the devil finding his way in another way. But it's clear the corruption is there, and it's been diminished over the years, and to the point we have today where so many priests, I mean, you know, we used to, as children, when you drove by a hospital, you made the sign of the cross. When you drove by a Catholic cemetery, you said a prayer. You know, you had all these devotions and everything. That's all gone. It's been diminished. It's like I know Dr. Marshall. I've had dinner with him as well. And he's a good man. He's an educated man. And I'm very impressed by him. But it's the infiltration started years ago, and it's been gradual. The devil is patient, obviously, and the faith has been diminished. Look at the bringing in of birth control. And this is another thing. It's the feminist movement was all part of it. Look at birth control. Now, when a young lady takes birth control, and so many people put their daughters on birth control, when a girl is on birth control, what does that say to her boyfriend or to any man? And it says, use me. I want to be used. No consequences. I mean, that's a crude way of putting it, but it's the truth. A woman diminishes her respect again. It's all part of anti-Catholicism, anti-God's plan. It diminishes the woman and the role of sex. Like I said before, the role of sex used to be something beautiful, something not discussed about. As I said, well, I shouldn't say that, but as when I was a child growing up, the greatest honor you could have was if a girl you liked would hold your hand. You didn't have all these filthy thoughts these guys do today. If a young girl would hold your hand, you felt you were king of the world. If she would let you put your arm on her shoulder, you were king. You know, you didn't think beyond that because this young girl would let you show that kind of affection. But the young girls today, they have to make sure that these young men would walk through fire just to hold her hand. Young men would walk through fire just to put their arm around their shoulder and demand respect from the young men. You know, sex used to be, as a teenager growing up, Sir Joy's boys talk about it and that sort of thing. But, you know, I can remember as a 13, 14-year-old walking to school, and I'll put this delicately, I was convinced, and I told Paul, who was walking, a friend of mine, I was convinced that how innocent we were back then. This has all been destroyed. I was convinced that husband and wife only had sex once in their life. And then you had so many children, because I could not imagine as a 13-year-old boy getting naked in front of a lady more than one time in my life. And so that's an innocence. That's a crude way of putting it, a simple way. But that's an innocence that's been destroyed. There is no sense of shame anymore, and that's all part of the corruption in the Catholic faith, where they've brought in all this feminism, they brought in sex education, and I know I'm getting a little wide on the topic now, but it's all part of it in my mind.
Stephen, just to talk what Angie just said now as well about Dr. Taylor Marshall, his book, Infiltration. If I go a little bit back, and Malachi Martin, he wrote a book in 1998 called Windswept House, where he documented in this book, it was more factual than fiction, but he said factual fiction, where he spoke about the evil within the Vatican. Now, this book was, some people criticized the book as he was trying to bring publicity to himself and all those things. What Malachi Martin was saying with regards to the satanic masses, how corrupt these bishops were, he even spoke about Cardinal Bernardine in his book, that was the former Cardinal of Chicago. Was it true?
Well, from what I'm learning now through my investigation, and from what I learned from sources, yes, much of what he said was true. The satanic masses were a real thing. When Malachi Martin first contacted me, I was working with and for Father John Hart, who is up for sainthood now. But Father Hart was working for the Vatican. His books are well worth reading. When Malachi Martin contacted me, because I'd heard the good and the bad about Malachi Martin, I didn't know who to believe or what to believe. So I called Father Hardin. I said, Father, should I work with him? What can you tell me about Father Malachi Martin? And Father John Hardin told me, and I quote, Father Malachi Martin is right with the church. That's all I needed. He let me know in his own way. He was a man of few words. He wouldn't say anything he didn't need to say. But he let me know in his own way that Father Martin was okay. He was right with the church. Now, you can interpret that any way you want to, but it gave me a clear go-ahead that I could work with him. And much of what Malachi Martin discussed with me and was in his books, I've seen through testimony, first-hand evidence to be true. The Agnes he spoke of at the satanic abuse situation in South Carolina, Agnes later in life introduced herself to me in Washington, D.C. I know her. I know where she lives now. I know who she is. And she's provided me with some documentation on the situation. And it's a very, very sad situation. One need only to research the name on the internet, Cardinal Bernardine, or Church Militant Cardinal Bernardine. And there's another organization that's come up with stories, factual stories regarding Cardinal Bernardine. I was called to help in a murder case in Chicago in the late 90s. Frank Pellegrini was murdered in 1984. And this is public record. And he was a church organist, a college professor who was going for his doctorate. He found out about a network of clergy that were abusing underprivileged boys. He had an appointment to go speak at the Chancery in Chicago. The day before his meeting at the Chancery, he was found brutally murdered. And later in the 90s, they got money from the feds for a cold case investigation. I was called up to Chicago by the prosecutor. I spoke with the murder investigator. They reopened the case. They wanted my help because I had interviewed a lady friend of Frank Pellegrini. I had information they hadn't received before. The murder is still unsolved. But this is a priest. I mean, this was a lay person, an organist, played the organ, a professor at one of the colleges, who was murdered the day before he could tell about the scandal he called the Boys Club, a network of homosexual clergy that were abusing underprivileged boys.
So, Stephen, at Quid Verum, our little tagline at the end of the videos about canon, we quote St. Paul, we paraphrase St. Paul, but we say we need to fight the good fight and keep the faith. Now, what advice can you give Catholics to be bold, to be brave, and to be strong?
Well, first of all, we have to accept the fact that the good Lord's in control. And we have to stick to the sacraments. We have to get a devotion to the Blessed Mother. But we have to have that mustard seed of faith. But beyond that, we have to find a good parish and a good priest, if we can. Find the best we can that's out there. Sometimes it's the lesser of evils. That being said, we have to speak up. We have to open our mouth when the situation arises. You never know what one thing you do is going to make a difference in somebody's life. And I'll give you a few examples. There was a priest advisor of mine who some time ago told me of a man knocking on his door about midnight wanting to go to confession. And Father said, absolutely. He said, I'm not going to turn somebody away that has a need for confession and an urgency. And he said, but why now? And he said, Father, I've been away from the church for 20 years. I was out to dinner tonight, and the family next to me at the table made the sign of the cross and said, grace. And that moved me to realize I've got to get back to the faith. So we never know what little thing we'll do, what little thing, sign of reverence, sign of faith, word we can say will make a difference. People also have to understand, and I'm taking a quote, I'm borrowing it from a Benedictine, and I can't remember the name. He said, it's not an act of charity to allow one's neighbor to run headlong into hell. Think about that. So many people think that being charitable means being nice and patting them on the back, fluffing their pillow. No. When you see someone discusses being in a situation that's clearly wrong, cohabitation, sex outside of marriage, homosexual activity, missing mass, and that sort of thing, not involving themselves in the sacraments, We have an obligation. The charitable thing to do is to kindly and gently as possible correct them. It's just like with our children. We're not getting in the good graces of our Lord, obviously, if we let our children do things, even adult children, and not say anything. If we let them, for example, a child shack up in a relationship when they're not married and they're cohabitating, we have to say something. We can't go over there and drag them out of the house or anything like that, but we have to speak our voice. We have to say something so they know what mortal sin is. They know what, objectively speaking, what can send a person to hell. And that being said, there's many situations in public life, whether it be conversations at a dinner party, an event, or talking with a friend, whether you're having a drink at a local tavern or whatnot. A situation may come up about the Catholic faith or something that's involves some moral issue. We have an obligation. We have to speak up. We may be disliked. We may be frowned upon for saying something at a particular moment. We don't have to make a big show of it, but we have to start speaking up as Catholics, even to priests. Even to priests. I had a woman I know, and this happened in this diocese years ago. The priest was rushing through Mass so fast, he was leaving out part of it, and this older lady, after Mass, talked to Father after Mass outside the parish, and she said, "Father, if you don't slow down, you're going to go to hell." Now, that's pretty blunt and pretty abrupt. It might have been handled in a more delicate manner, but I'm saying a woman can get away with stuff that a man can't many times over, because everybody should love their mother and has that sort of affection to the motherly type. But that being said, we have to speak up, even to the bishop, even to the priest, even to the fellow parishioners. I had the RCI program at a local parish. People would come out of this program introducing non-Catholics into the faith. They didn't know what the rosary was. They didn't know what mortal sin was. They didn't know what the church taught about birth control. So we have to stand up to our church officials at the local parish, whether it's layperson or religious, with their education programs, if they're not doing what they should be doing. And also, all these extraordinary ministers and altar girls, in a subtle way, in a way that we can find comfortable, where we don't harm too many people with this, we need to point out the fact that all these things came about because of sin. Women aren't supposed to be in the sanctuary. Women aren't supposed to be serving at Mass, not because they're any lesser than men, because they're better than men. They have a different role in life and within the church as well. And then you can go into the role of men and women as well. But it's not to degrade women, but they have their place, and it's a few steps above men. But I think we need to make this clear, because women are beginning to dress like men, to act like men, to talk like men. You know, it used to be we wouldn't tell an off-color joke in front of a lady. Now it goes on all the time. Men talk in front of women like they're one of the guys. And I think women need to object to this, and we need to get back to the. And again, as I've said many times publicly in the past, the teenage girl can change the world by demanding that teenage boy walk through fire just to hold her hand. Demand that boy loves Christ more than he loves her. And, waiting sexes for marriage only, because as I said, Dr. Ellis von Hildebrand once said in her talk on feminism, the job of the female is to tame the barbarian men. So there's many things women can do, especially because, as my grandmother once told me, she said, any good woman can completely control her husband while making him think he runs everything. So it's true. But we all have to speak up in our own way, in our own situation, depending on what comes up. Even young people. Sometimes a child can say things. The innocence and honesty of a child. And sometimes we think it's the most inopportune moment, but a child can say things that really hits home in a very innocent but hard-hitting way. So that's it. We've got to have the faith. We've got to get the devotion going to the Blessed Mother. And we have to start opening our mouth, each in our own way, as the situation arises.
Well, we would really like to thank you, Steve, for being on our first caffeinated Catholic conversation. And we would like to see you back in the future in our future caffeinated conversations. But thank you so much for your time. We have learned a lot, and we pray that you continue, just like St. Michael, to defend and protect our church. God bless.
Well, thank you guys for what you do, and thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you in person someday. When I finish up with this lawsuit, my wife and I were talking about coming out your way, so we look forward to that day.
Very welcome. Thank you, Stephen.